Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, jointly hosted by Illumio and Appgate on the topic of Zero Trust Network Access plus Zero Trust Segmentation, delivering end-to-end Zero Trust. Before we get into the intros and the great content we've lined up for you today, I have a few housekeeping items. Number one, for those of you in the audience, please use the Q&A panel to submit your questions. We have a Q&A section near the end, and we will answer as many as possible and follow up on the others. And number two, you will receive the recording after this webinar. So with that, let's get into the introductions. So again, hello everyone, I'm John Skinner, VP of Business Development here at Illumio, and it's my great pleasure to be joined by our partners from Appgate, Tony Zernoon, Head of Strategic Alliances and Partnerships, and Justin Yentile, Director of Sales Engineering. We're all here today to talk about leveraging Zero Trust Network Access and Zero Trust Segmentation. Here's what we'll be covering specifically today. So first we'll cover what is Zero Trust and why does it matter? This is of course a very important sort of foundational question. Tony will then provide an introduction to Zero Trust Network Access using the example of the Appgate SDP platform. I'll then provide an overview of Zero Trust Segmentation as implemented by Illumio. We'll then show how ZTNA and ZTS can be combined into an end-to-end Zero Trust solution that addresses both the perimeter network and the interior east-west network. We'll show how this can be done by integrating the Illumio and Appgate platforms together. And finally, we'll close with some Q&A. So let's start with the question of what is Zero Trust? Well, let's start with the assumption of Zero Trust, which is that unexpected things can and will happen at any time. The principle of Zero Trust assumes that breach or intrusion is inevitable. So then the name of the game becomes, what can you do before that next breach occurs in order to prepare your infrastructure to be resilient against that breach? And so that sort of assumption of breach drives the following requirements for effective cyber defense. Number one is visibility. You need visibility everywhere to ensure that every interaction on the network is accounted for. Number two is least privilege. Least privilege access to prevent unexpected breaches from propagating across the network. Number three is adaptability and dynamism. Adaptability and consistency to guarantee a consistent network behavior everywhere. And number four is a proactive posture to always be on the lookout for an attack. So why does Zero Trust matter? Well, number one, it enables digital transformation. The accelerated adoption of digital services needs a security approach that is equally as agile as your DevOps and innovation efforts. Number two, Zero Trust is important to mitigate the inherent risk that exists in a hyper-connected environment. Hyperconnectivity means that a single compromise can test the cyber resilience of an entire organization. Hyperconnectivity is actually the state that the attacker is relying on to be able to take their initial intrusion and propagate across the entire network very rapidly. And then Zero Trust matters for a third reason, because it mitigates the risk associated with technical debt. We all know that aging technology stacks introduce technical complexity and makes it difficult to mitigate vulnerabilities. And so a Zero Trust strategy is a mitigating factor against those types of risks. So with that, let's talk about the challenge that Illumio's and Appgate's customers often bring to us as they're preparing their Zero Trust strategy. And so we'll start with the Illumio side of the equation, where customers will often ask us or tell us, I need to implement a zero trust strategy. I know I need to do this because I need to protect my crown jewels, my high value assets that are on my interior network. But how and where do I start? And so, if we look at sort of a very simplified view of an internal east-west network, you have databases, you have applications, you have web servers, you have other systems that are all connected to each other on your internal network. But some of these are high value assets that need special protection and that would benefit from perhaps some isolation or at least the enforcement of least privilege in terms of what other systems can and cannot talk to them. So that's sort of how we look at the problem from the left side, which is the interior network. But let's switch now to the perimeter network, where Appgate is helping customers solve the zero trust network access problem. So Tony, what sort of conversations do you folks have?
Well, indeed, John. When it comes to north-south, right, our customers tell us that they need a way to ensure that the right users can gain access to the right resources under the right circumstances. Well, that sounds easy enough, right? But what they really need is help assessing user identity, roles, device posture, and a variety of other contexts before granting access, but also they want to evaluate any context change that happens or behavior so they can dynamically adjust the trust level a user, a device, or an entity, be it an IoT device or a Kubernetes container, should be granted throughout the session.
So thank you for that, Tony. So again, these are the customer challenges that we hear frequently from customers and potential customers. So let's talk about how Illumio and Appgate and other organizations are helping simplify how you start this journey to zero trust. So what I'm showing here is actually a summary of what you'll find in NIST Special Publication 800-207, where NIST has prescribed 3 complementary and necessary zero trust enforcement approaches. And we give full marks to NIST for really producing an excellent document and a zero trust architecture that really helps simplify any organization's journey towards zero trust. It can help you really sort of eliminate all the noise that's in the marketplace and help you determine what's important and what's not. And from a NIST perspective, when they talk about zero trust enforcement approaches, they boil it down to these 3 foundational elements. And those 3 policy enforcement points are, number 1, enhanced identity governance. Number 2, a software-defined perimeter, also known as a zero trust network access platform. And then simultaneously, they prescribe a microsegmentation solution for the internal network, for the east-west network. They prescribe these 3 enforcement approaches need to be in place simultaneously to achieve a zero trust posture. Now, of course, there's many other products and technologies that are necessary in a complete cyber defense approach. But these 3 foundational elements, if you employ them, will enable you to make tremendous strides towards implementing a zero trust architecture and can simplify the task of executing your organization's zero trust journey. So with that as background, let's talk about how you can identify which ZTNA platform and which microsegmentation or ZTS platform are considered by industry experts to be best of breed within their respective category. So Tony, if you could please share with the audience some of the accolades and ratings that Appgate has received from the analyst community.
You got it. Thank you, John. So Appgate has been recognized as a leader in ZTNA Forrester Wave with the most robust offering in the market, which is powered by a scalable and adaptable platform enriched with a bidirectional API framework. We also have been recognized as a leader in the Zero Trust Extended Ecosystem platform next to you guys, Illumio, right? And that's not surprising, John, given that today's hybrid world, users, networks, resources have all extended beyond the traditional legacy networks and perimeter. And thus, the zero trust strategy itself needs to adapt and address security challenges for both the extended north-south as well as the east-west network corridors, what to call them, right? The connectivity. And that's basically where we found each other, right? We were sitting next to each other. We found this complementary nature. So back to you, John.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So yeah, in that middle box there, it's no coincidence that Appgate and Illumio are working together, because if you look at that report from Forrester, we are right next to each other in the uppermost right corner of that Forrester wave as co-industry leaders, but in two different categories, right? So again, Appgate independently is a leader within the zero trust network access category. And then earlier this year, Forrester issued their first ever microsegmentation category report, which similar to Appgate positioned us as an upper right-hand corner leader within the microsegmentation category. So what we are helping the market to do is take advantage of not just the coexistence of two best of breed leaders, but an actual technical integration between them, which we'll talk about later. So first, before we get into the details of how we've integrated our products, we're going to do just a brief overview of each of the two products, starting with Zero Trust Network Access. And so, Tony, if you want to go ahead and take it from
Sure.
here.
So what I'm going to do is take a few minutes to cover, as you mentioned, the problem and pain points Appgate SDP addresses. In other words, the why for Appgate. I'll provide a high-level overview of our ZTNA platform, our deployment options, share some typical use cases we have been addressing for our customers, and some of the key benefits that they have seen. So a lot has changed, right? We all know digital transformation, innovation is reshaping the world faster than ever before. Things are vastly different than it was 5-10 years ago. And even recently as 2020, we just went through the pandemic. The same is true for enterprise and IT professionals who are challenged to keep up, not to mention a 4 million talent gap that we have to deal with in cybersecurity, which can't be ignored anymore. Workers are everywhere now, but also resources are everywhere. BYOD is a new norm, and it brings together with itself a plethora of security challenges. These challenges lead to a massive and ephemeral attack surface, and is probably why today many security professionals either now assume breach or have shifted to a when, not if we get breach mindset. At the end of the day, the largest attack surface and the weakest link is people accessing network resources, not IT. And people are fallible, we all make mistakes, and are gullible, can be duped. This is why people-defined security is so important. So in Appgate, we believe that people are the new perimeter. By that, I mean our trust in people, which to me is people identity plus people behavior. At the end, the 20-year-old security paradigm of trust but verify isn't working. Definitely not against the increasing threat landscape and sophisticated threat actors. And that security must evolve. And the evolution is zero trust. But there's a lot of hype, a lot of confusion, and we're here to help demystify that. So Appgate SDP platform, it follows the 800 207 NIST as a guideline. We map pretty well with it. And we do simple things. We ensure that who can connect to where, under which circumstances, where and where. The who can be users, regular users, privileged users, can be an IoT device, a BYOD device, third party, or even Kubernetes containers. And they can connect to their resources in this extended new world, whether it's on-prem, data centers, public, private, cloud, flavors of the cloud, or your SaaS applications. And circumstances change. Change is dynamic, whether it's as a device posture change that we get from a zero trust score from your favorite EDR, and also be able to assess from where they can connect and when is it they can have those connections. The way we accomplish this is through a 5 set of principles, design principles or tenets, which makes Appgate SDP so flexible and agile. The first one is our cloaked infrastructure. I call this hackers can attack what they can see. We use a sophisticated single packet authorization, or for short SPA, to make your network invisible where no ports are exposed. The benefit of it is the 2 endpoints connecting through this secure tunnel, they're cloaked and they're protected. So we can protect those that can't protect themselves. Second one, as I mentioned a little bit before, is people-centric. What we mean is it is people or identity-centric security that adapts access based on user, device, application, or other contextual risk, building what we call a multi-dimensional identity profile before access is granted. Well, that is great. That's where things start. But it's critical and equally important, perhaps more, that this platform, this zero trust ushering that we do, has to be dynamic and continuous. We call these live entitlements. They can automatically modify access in near real time based on changes in context and risk, so the security risks are automatically blocked. This is what I meant by people defined. Trust is identity plus behavior. We need to assess that constantly. Just because you granted access to someone doesn't mean that they should enjoy that throughout the session if they start misbehaving. The latter two, it builds individual just-in-time session-based micro firewalls. This is why we were on that middle session on the Forrester wave. Perimeters that we call segments, for one, using patented multi-tunneling technology that microsegments users access to workloads and resources, providing least privileged access wherever these resources may be. Doing this needs to also be extensible, and we offer an extensible 100% API-first technology, as I mentioned earlier. This enhances and integrates with your existing technology stack and allows us to build security directly into the fabric of your business processes and workflows. It is the combination of these pillars that makes Appgate SDP a ZTNA for all solution. We also understand that zero trust is a journey, and every customer has a different journey, and thus we offer a variety of deployment options. However, there's one key differentiation between Appgate and our competitors, and that is we do not require our customers to compromise privacy for sake of achieving zero trust security. We are a direct routed model versus an alternative proxy-based cloud-routed solutions in the market, which will require the customer to fully trust their vendors as they traverse third-party or public cloud-routed networks. In the ZTNA reference architecture, for those of us who are familiar, there is a separation of control plane from a data plane, as you can see. So in the first model, which we call it a cloud-hosted model, both the controller, which sets the policy, and our newly announced zero trust platform, which was instantly announced today, are both cloud hosted. Today we announced our cloud native, cloud delivered, not to be confused with cloud routed zero trust platform, with built-in risk engine designed to help enterprise easily deploy and maintain a cohesive security ecosystem, maximize existing investments, and accelerate their zero trust security maturity. This option obviously speeds Appgate's SDP deployments with a unique as-a-service approach and retains customer control of the network traffic. Remember, that was a distinction I made between cloud routed and cloud delivered, and reduces infrastructure management overhead. The second model is a connected model. So here, we have customers that require a little bit more of a control and governance over the SDP controller and want to deploy the controller on-prem or in their private cloud. Well, we allow for that. They can still leverage the benefit of our cloud-hosted ZTP, which offers, as I mentioned, a risk engine service that enhances access policies with rich security context via click-to-configure connections to third-party IT, security, and business solutions as we continue to expand our no-code integrations with the technology partners in our ecosystem. So it's a hybrid model. And the last one is an isolated model. It's for those that really require full control and governance and looking for an isolated deployment model. They want to be in full control. They want zero trust privacy with zero trust security. The great thing is that, albeit in this isolated model, they don't have access to the newly announced ZTP platform. They can still benefit from our existing integrations with Appgate SDP controller, leveraging a robust set of APIs and our built-in resolvers, like is the case with Illumio Core, as we're going to discover further today. So what business problems are we solving for our customers? Well, our customers adopt Appgate for many different use cases. I'm highlighting a few typical ones that we're seeing. Obviously, given the post-pandemic and as we went through this, remote access, replacing VPN is a no-brainer, and we've seen a lot of success with a lot of customers. Whether it's remote access to their IT infrastructure, their OT, or the hybrid cloud resources, as well as granting access to third-party access. Cloud migration presents several unique and challenging problems for companies. We all see this, we all are following the same news, that we help address with our patented multi-tunnel capabilities. We're not seeing people going to one cloud and stay there. We see a lot of people migrating from the public, private, and the hybrid model, and they need to equally have secure access that assesses that user, their posture, their device posture, and all that context at the time of granting access, but throughout those sessions. That's what Appgate brings to the table, makes it very easy, and that's where we see our customers really enjoy the benefits. When it comes to securing DevOps, things get more interesting. Appgate brings a concept of instant access to programmatically deployed environments, security as a code, all based on environment metadata and dynamic resolution across the modern cloud and hypervisor platforms. Here it is, we call it our resolvers, where we bring context, whether they're tags or labels, and bring that to provide additional context, make it more application aware and more DevOps friendly. We are enhancing this even more through our integration with Illumio Core, as we will discuss in this session. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Tony. And again, reminder for everyone, if you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A panel, and we'll get to those later in this session. So with that, let's take a look at zero trust segmentation, which again was one of the 3 foundational elements prescribed by NIST, also known as microsegmentation. And so to put the sort of concept of east-west and northwest networks into context here, I wanted to sort of walk you through how breaches often start, where some attacker is able to create an initial intrusion, perhaps from the perimeter network coming in. And so without something like Appgate to provide the fine-grained zero trust access, it's all too common and all too risky for users and devices to be a transport mechanism for malware from the perimeter network into the internal east-west network. So that's sort of the first attack vector here that we're going to show, is how easy it is for an attacker to gain entry into the internal network through that north-south perimeter. But once that attacker has that initial intrusion on the internal network, it's very easy for them to rapidly spread across the entire environment. And here you can see, there's a risk and a network of server-to-server traffic that the attacker can exploit to rapidly move within a data center. But that's not the only compute environment typically connected to the data center. We also have the risk of endpoints, PCs, other types of personal devices that are connected to the data center that enable additional spread from endpoint to endpoint. A fourth one, which certainly affects operators of critical infrastructure, is the risk of spread into the OT network from the IT network, either from endpoints or from the data center. Furthermore, there's in a cloud environment, many applications in the on-premises environment are communicating with applications in the cloud environment. So you have this risk of spread from on-premises to the cloud. And then if you're operating a multi-cloud, you have the risk of cloud to cloud, or in a Kubernetes or containerized environment, of pod to pod breach spread. So these hyperconnectivities that exist in a typical organization, this level of interconnectivity of all these different compute environments, is precisely what a ransomware attacker, for example, will rely upon to rapidly spread their initial intrusion across the entire organization. So with that as sort of the backdrop of how most organizations have their networks hyper-connected to each other, it requires us to take a different approach to cyber defense. It means that you have to assume that an undetected intrusion will inevitably occur, and that you therefore need to take steps to minimize the potential spread radius of that initial intrusion. And the way to do that is by employing both preemptive and reactive breach containment. Now, the tools that we've traditionally used for security to keep attackers out, they've effectively, unfortunately, have failed us the last several years. It's because those tools were not designed to address the new challenge of preemptive and reactive containment. If we look backward in time, we had the prevention era of the 2000s. The strategy in that time frame was keep the bad guys out by building a bigger moat or build more moats. It was entirely sort of defense in depth, aimed at keeping bad guys from getting in. But as we saw in the subsequent decade, the attackers are able to get in. They also can launch insider-based attacks. And so that sort of gave way to the 2010s decade, where much of the focus was on, detection and response, finding them quickly. And unfortunately, that has proven to be insufficient as a defense approach, also because of the stealth and speed of these attacks. They often remain undetected for a long enough period of time to rapidly propagate across a network and, for example, begin the encryption process before EDRs and other types of systems can complete the signature analysis to determine that, yes, this is ransomware. Well, by that point, it's often too late. And so because of all of the shortcomings of these legacy tools, the new era of containment, both preemptive and reactive containment, is the best practice of today. And so, this shift towards assuming a breach, and assuming that an intrusion will inevitably occur and then will exploit the hyperconnectivity to rapidly propagate across that network. This has really fueled this tectonic shift in security towards an approach of preemptive and reactive containment. Now, what that gives rise to is a need for a zero trust strategy. And zero trust segmentation of the internal east-west network is the modern security approach to employ this type of containment. And unlike prevention and detection technologies, zero trust segmentation contains the spread of breaches and ransomware across that entire propagation service that I covered earlier, all those different compute environments, whether it's IT, whether it's OT, whether it's on-premises, whether it's cloud, whether it's bare metal, VMs, or containers. That complexity and hyper interconnectivity of all these different compute environments is precisely what the ransomware attacker will be relying upon to move from point A to point B to point Z and every point in between. What it does is preemptively segment that environment to proactively limit the maximum spread potential of that initial intrusion. And what Illumio enables our customers to do is create granular policies that allow only the wanted and necessary interconnectivities to remain, enforcing the principle of least privilege. And these Illumio-based policies automatically isolate breaches by restricting the lateral movement, by preemptively minimizing the potential spread radius, both preemptively and during an attack. Now, Gartner, Forrester, and other analyst firms all agree that zero trust segmentation is a foundational and strategic pillar of any zero trust architecture. In the case of NIST, they referred to it as microsegmentation, if you recall. And so in this graphic, this blue box from Gartner, it demonstrates how an organization must first commit to a zero trust approach. It's a conscious decision that an organization can and must take. From there, they can build a systematic strategy that assumes the intrusion, that assumes that the breach will inevitably occur, and enables them to then take a systematic approach to preemptively enforcing the principle of least privilege by preemptively segmenting the network before the next attacker shows up. And this journey is continued by implementing not only ZTNA, ZTS, but also, as Tony discussed, ZTNA in parallel. It's those two foundational pillars, along with enhanced identity governance, are what make up those three main pillars of the NIST Zero Trust architecture. So let's dig into the Illumio platform specifically. With Illumio's Zero Trust segmentation, organizations can quickly and easily do three things. Number one, they can see risk. Illumio enables you to see risk and to visualize all the communication and traffic and all of the excessive connectivity in your as-is network between workloads and devices across all those environments that we talked about earlier. For example, you can see which servers are talking to which business critical apps, either in your data center, in your cloud, and which of those data center applications might be connected perhaps in an excessively privileged way to devices in your OT network, for example. So step number one, see the risk. Step number two is set policies. So with every change that may occur in workload context, Illumio enables you to automatically set granular and flexible segmentation policies that limit and control the communications between workloads and other compute systems across that expanded surface. You can decide what you wish to allow to remain of your existing connectivities. You can enable the ones that reflect least privilege. And you can use this sort of limitation of interconnectivity to create full or partial boundaries between different environments. For example, create a boundary between your dev environment and your production environment. Or, for example, to enforce the principle of least privilege in how systems in your IT network are connected and communicating with systems in your OT network. You can create full or partial boundaries between the two. Step number three is to stop the spread. So once you've completed your sort of visualization of all of the excessive connectivities, and then set policies to reduce them down to a least privileged level, and you've put in place these segmentation barriers, you as an Illumio customer can preemptively limit the maximum spread potential of an intrusion into any particular segment of the network. You can isolate your high value assets, and you can get the propagation options of the attacker. Now, when that attacker does inevitably show up and attempts to move laterally, Illumio, together with an analytics platform like a SIM platform, where we have multiple integrations, the Illumio telemetry can help you quickly detect those lateral movement attempts, many of which will fail, but will help you detect that lateral attacker quickly. And then you have the opportunity to either manually or automatically begin sort of shrinking that spread radius, begin sort of tightening the noose around that particular attacker that you have duly detected. And so we give you the opportunity to further tighten down the network, for example, by selectively blocking the specific port or protocol that the ransomware is exploiting, that we help you sort of discover what propagation path they're using and allow you to shut down that port or protocol on all or selected workloads. And again, this can be done either manually in the Illumio tool or through a third-party tool like a SOAR platform, where we've built integrations with the 3 leading SOAR platforms that enable you to do this with just a couple of clicks. So if we look at the Illumio platform itself, you'll see that we have designed it to take advantage of our ability to ingest third-party data, as you can see on the left-hand side, in terms of IoT and OT device visibility through our integrations with those types of platforms. We're able to import vulnerability data from platforms like Qualys, Rapid7, and Tenable. We can also import other types of threat and risk intelligence on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, again, using our well-documented, relatively mature API, we can send metadata easily into other third-party tools, as I mentioned, SIM platforms and SOAR platforms. And then across the top, you can see some of the use cases that these platform capabilities, that these extended capabilities enable you to address, whether that's ransomware isolation, cloud security, as we talked about earlier, segmentation of IT versus OT environments, mitigation of supply chain attacks, etc. So each of these capabilities, again, can be extended across all of your environments, whether it's on-premises data center, cloud, or endpoints. So putting this all together, the business results of this capability sort of speak for themselves. Based on technical analysis and testing done by independent analyst firms, we've seen some tremendous value delivered to customers in a very short period of time. We would refer you to our website for a report from the independent analyst firm Bishop Fox, where they determined that Illumio stops ransomware attacks in an average of 10 minutes, which is 4 times faster than using detection and response alone. Another report done by the analyst firm Enterprise Strategy Group showed that on average, the use of Illumio's zero trust segmentation can prevent, on average, 5 cyber disasters per year from ever occurring. Now, Illumio also, because of the improvements in uptime and cyber resilience, helps you accelerate your innovation. And so, again, I would refer you to our website for some of the reports which show that on average, Illumio customers are able to complete 14 more digital transformation projects per year than they'd otherwise be able to achieve. And again, this is thanks to the reduction in downtime from not having to fight cyber intrusions that would have otherwise spread quickly and become uncontained cyber disasters. And then finally, we're able to help our customers reduce their costs. Again, the analysis by Enterprise Strategy Group showed a savings of, on average, about $20 million savings in annual downtime cost avoidance per average organization, along with a 68% faster mean time to recovery from each cyber attack. So by using both these preemptive and these reactive reduction of the maximum spread radius of each attack, you not only minimize the damage, you also simplify and shorten the task of each recovery, which saves money and time. So with that, we're going to talk about how do we bring these two platforms together that we've talked about, both the ZTNA from Appgate and the ZTS from Illumio. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Tony.
Awesome, John. Well, we covered a lot of ground, folks, and I think you can see that each of us is providing great value, right? We certainly hear very similar benefits to the ones that, John, you mentioned in FD reduction, in time to deployment, or provisioning user access, and all that stuff is great. So now ZTNA, in our case, we have a great solution, and we've made sure that we can bring the right users to the right resources across these north-south corridors. But customers also need to ensure that these individuals are only authorized to do the right things across the east-west wings. We also, through the course of the secure sessions, there can be changes in both user context, device posture change, as well as workload context, as John, you were talking. So there is a need still to dynamically monitor, assess, and adapt user entitlements to these contextual changes. Failure to do so means that you leave some gaps, right? Failure to adapt to the user entitlement, to the user context, or to the workload context. So there's going to be a lot of context switching, a lot of manual work. So that's the residual problem that we're seeing. And how do we solve this? Well, through the integration between Illumio Core and Appgate SDP. Illumio, as you heard John depict, controls the east-west movement using zero trust segmentation. But they do that while sharing those workload context changes with Appgate SDP controller. So now we have the workload context. In some ways, we are more application aware zero trust access. This enables us to dynamically adjust user entitlements based on any changes in those workloads, on those contexts by consuming the Illumio labels, and whether that's a role, an environment, an application, or location, which governs the east-west axis, as well as any changes that we have typically done in user context, device posture, governing the north-south axis. John, do you want to dig in a little bit more into this?
Yeah, thank you, Tony. So looking at the next level of detail, again, we have the east-west network in this diagram on the left-hand side. In the middle, you have your perimeter network, your north-south network. And on the right-hand side, outside of that perimeter, you have your users and devices, which are gaining access in a controlled way through Appgate. But let's dig into the left-hand side first, where in a typical organization, you may have a three-tier sort of architecture sitting on the internal east-west network, comprised of, from left to right, a database tier, an application tier, and a web tier. The web tier is the tier that is meant to be exposed to the internet via that north-south network in the middle, also known as the network perimeter. And as represented by the orange dashed lines between each of those three tiers, in this case, Illumio has been deployed and is ensuring preemptive segmentation and least privilege between those three left to right tiers. So many organizations believe they have a three-tier architecture, but if everything in the web tier is communicating with everything in the database tier, that's not really three-tier. What you really need to do is enforce the principle of least privilege amongst these three tiers. Now, Consistent with the principle of least privilege, Illumio can also enable the creation of a zero trust boundary for, as shown in this example, between the top and bottom of the slide. In other words, between the production environment at the top and the dev environment at the bottom. And in many organizations, only dev engineers should have access to dev workloads, and only prod engineers should have access to prod workloads. Well, how do you enforce that least privilege? You do that by using Illumio to create this full or partial boundary between prod and dev. But what if, for example, unbeknownst to the identity platform or the ZTNA platform, a dev workload is suddenly promoted to prod? This would be a context change that perhaps the identity platform might struggle with. And as Tony highlighted, you might now have a security gap where a dev engineer gets routed to a workload that was only recently promoted to prod. Or what if a dev workload or a prod workload, unbeknownst to that identity platform, is suddenly migrated from on-premises to the cloud with a new IP address and a new pathway to reach it? That'd be another type of context change that the identity platform would otherwise not be aware of. Or what if a dev workload, again, unbeknownst to the identity or average ZTNA platform, suddenly came under attack and needed to be quarantined and protected from any type of exterior access? These are all examples of real-time context changes that occur frequently inside of organizations with these large compute environments. And of course, Illumio is able to seamlessly handle these types of context changes. And the way we do it is by using abstraction, specifically by enabling our customers to assign natural language labels to every workload, where it can be labeled as dev or prod, and simultaneously as either web tier, application tier, or database tier, for example. And so this abstraction ensures that all zero trust enforcement remains consistent and persistent with whatever zero trust policy is appropriate for that workload's context, including what policy is appropriate if that workload context has changed. And now what we're sharing today is, for the first time, that level of seamless adaptation to workload context change in the east-west network is now built into the north-south perimeter controls via Illumio's integration with Appgate and Appgate's innovation of those same Illumio labels to track the workload context changes. So with that, let me hand it off to Tony, who will describe what's happening on the right side of the diagram within the Appgate ZTNA.
Well, indeed, John, I mean, it's exactly this level of abstraction that we talked about, right? Those labels, right, that Appgate leverages now to make our ZTNA application aware. By using these labels, which in turn delivers more granularity, more granular visibility, that we use to enforce dynamic adjustments in user entitlements, reflecting any change in workload context. You mentioned that could be a label got changed from dev to prod. Well, at the end of the day, we understand IPs, right? So there's two sides of the story. One is from security, make sure that somebody who is in, the prod, dev app X doesn't have access to, a prod web application X. Well, that's great. But you also mentioned that what if somebody got moved? Well, that's also continuity, right? In the DevOps world that I talked about earlier. And that means that if a workload somehow got moved, well, the IP address will change. Without this abstraction and granular visibility, there would be an outage, there would be a ticket. Hey, I cannot get access to do my work. But using that label, we are granting access based on that label. Now that label is an abstraction. If the change happened, those context changes, the underlying IP address would have been notified. And the entitlement says, Tony can connect to the, dev web app X, whatever that IP address changed, it's already abstracted. So it's also not just securing access, but also providing continuity. And often we forget that there is this availability aspect to security, right? Which sometimes we infringe upon ourselves. At the end of the day, This ensures that the right individuals gain access only to the right microperimeters that we built together, both east-west and north-south, but they can only do the right things within those segments. Imagine being able to dynamically adjust zero trust access policies based on a user role or their method of authentication. If it's Tony or a super Tony using a FIDO key, those are different identities. A device posture can change. For instance, you want to make sure that provide more governance and say, you know what, you cannot access AWS prod VPCs from a VDI. But also, as John mentioned, to be able to dynamically adjust this entitlement based on any change on the other side of the corridor, like it was the change from a label from dev to prod. So to kind of show you that, I'll pass it on to Justin to show you how these two platforms come together, and it will cover some of these scenarios in the demo that he has prepared for us today. Justin, to you, sir.
Thanks, Tony. All right, so let's take a quick look at a simplified architecture of the integrated solution. Very simply, on the left side of this diagram, you see some of the Appgate components. They are in this teal color. And on the right side, you see the Illumio policy compute engine with its functions in orange. And just to quickly walk through what we're looking at here. So in the far left, we have a user. In this case, this is going to represent me during the course of a demonstration. And so I'll be playing the role of a QA user. And ultimately, my Appgate client will first initiate a connection to the Appgate controller. And the Appgate controller will validate my identity against any identity providers that communicate via Radius, LDAP, SAML, or OIDC. And upon validating my identity, one of the things that will occur is obviously we'll pull back group membership information. And in doing so, I'll be determined to be a member of the QA group. In step 3 here, you can see that the controller is actually communicating directly with the Illumio PCE and is actually pulling back, in this case, information about workloads that have been deployed and labels that are associated with those workloads. In step 4, we're returning information from the controller back to the Appgate client running on the QA user's workstation that contains information about where the resources are that this user is allowed to access and the gateways that protect them. And so in step 5, the Appgate client will then dynamically connect to Appgate gateways. And step 6 shows that the user is being allowed to access only the protected QA resources because they're a member of that QA group. Now, on the back end, the Illumio PCE is actually controlling the east-west microsegmentation there. So once allowed to access the QA resources, this QA user will not be able to access any of the production resources. And so with that, let's dive right into a quick demonstration here. Okay, so you should now be seeing my screen here. And obviously, we are looking at the Illumio console. And specifically, I've got the illumination map pulled up in front of us. I have my illumination map in draft view, and I have applied a location label for my AWS Northern Virginia environment. And this is where we'll be performing our demonstration today. In this environment, as you can see, I've deployed 3 groups of resources, and I've labeled these resources as blue production, red production, and red QA. Again, I'm playing the role of a member of the QA team. So ultimately, Appgate will be pulling this information in from Illumio to allow me to access only these instances that are deployed as QA labeled resources. Now, on the back end, Illumio is, as I mentioned, is controlling the east-west microsegmentation here. And so from a microsegmentation perspective, we have a very basic policy that essentially allows for QA labeled resources to communicate with one another. And it also allows for production labeled resources to communicate with one another within the same application group. We are not, however, allowing any intergroup communication. So we see a lot of red arrows between those resource groups here. Just to kind of point out some of the instances I'll be working with through this demonstration, I do want to point out that my production database server is currently at an IP address of 10.201.4.9. My 2 QA instances here have IP addresses that end in 4.7 and 4.8. I'm just pointing those out so that you can distinguish between them as we proceed into our demonstrations. This is the Appgate client. As you can see here, I am currently signed in. I've actually been connected to 3 sites, and one of those sites is this AWS North Virginia site. What that means is essentially that I've been served at least one Appgate entitlement to something in that site. And so my Appgate client has actually connected to a gateway there. There's really nothing more for me to know about that from an end user perspective, really just pointing that out to you to show you that this is what I've been connected to. Again, playing the role of a member of the QA team, I've now moved over to my command prompt here, and I'm going to first attempt to log into one of the production resources. And so when I issue this SSH command attempting to reach that 10.201.4.9 instance, as expected, my SSH attempt is actually going to time out here. I'm not going to be able to access that resource, and I should not be as a member of the QA team. I should, however, be able to access the two QA resources. And so in real time, again, Appgate is pulling in label information from Illumio to determine that I should be able to access those resources. Now, one thing to point out here is that we've actually applied a condition on the Appgate side that actually requires a more stringent level of security control in the form of step-up multi-factor authentication in order for me to access this QA resource. And so this is helpful in preventing a situation where an unlocked laptop maybe is swiped at a coffee shop and a bad guy now has access to the crown jewels and everything on your network. And so in doing this, I'm actually prompted, as you can see here, for MFA first. We chose to require FIDO2 or YubiKey authentication for that. But upon responding to that by tapping on the side of my YubiKey, as you can see here, I've been allowed to log into this 4.7 QA resource. Just to show you that the same thing would be true if I were to log into or attempt to log into the 4.8 resource. If I issue my SSH command pointing at 4.8, I can reach that resource. Now, much like with my local attempts to access the production resource, again, Illumio is controlling east-west microsegmentation here. So I should not be able to move laterally and access the production resource from one of these QA resources. So if I issue this SSH command attempting to reach the 4.9 from the 4.8 here, as you can see, that SSH attempt will time out. But I should be able to move laterally over to the 4.7 server, and I'm allowed to do that. As you can see here, I've been able to log into 4.7 from 4.8. I'm now logging out of the 4.7 from 4.8 and logging out of the 4.8 entirely. So as you can see, I'm sitting back at the command prompt on my local workstation. And what we're going to do next is what would happen if we were to change the label on one of these resources. And so for this, I'm going to actually move that production labeled resource into my QA group. And so in doing so, what I'm doing here is opening up the workload configuration. I'm going to take a look at this 4.9 instance, and we're going to dynamically move this from production to QA and save it. After saving this, within a few seconds here, we'll come back to the illumination map, and we should see that that formerly production labeled resource will now appear in the group with the QA resources. And after we do that, we'll initiate an attempt to reach that resource as a member of the QA team. So again, as we can see here, I can reach, the 4.9 resource is now in my QA labeled group. And so if I were to attempt this same demonstration pointing at the 4.9 resource now, as you can see here, within a few seconds, I'm able to reach that resource. Now, there's one last thing I do want to demonstrate here for you, and that is that we've also applied another condition for access to these QA labeled resources in the form of some posture assessment. And for very basic demonstrational purposes here, I've chosen to apply a policy that essentially forbids my end users from having any sort of virtualization software open on their workstation while they are interacting with these. So what I'm doing right now is opening up my Parallels desktop. And just by the nature of having this application running, I'm now forbidden from accessing those QA resources. And so within a few seconds here, if I attempt to reach the 4.9 resource again, as you can see here, I'm not allowed to do so. The Appgate client has just popped up a message stating that the reason that access is denied is because I'm running something that's forbidden. There's obviously a lot more that we can do here in terms of applying dynamic policies and access for protected resources. But hopefully this has been helpful in terms of helping you to understand how Appgate and Illumio can better help you control access to your protected and sensitive resources. All right, thank you very much. Back over to you, Tony and John.
Thanks, Justin. Well, a demo is worth 1,000 words, so nicely done. Before we move on to the Q&A, let's summarize what we've covered today. 3 key takeaways from this webinar. Number 1, Zero Trust is a journey. The sooner you start, the sooner you'll improve your Zero Trust posture, and hopefully we've given you some information to help you get started. Number 2, Zero Trust is proven. It is the current best practice for how to mitigate the risk of stealthy, rapidly moving lateral attacks. And number 3, the integration of Illumio and Appgate together gives you this risk reduction in a pre-integrated way. So simplifying your ability to put in place those 3 foundational controls that NIST prescribes. So with that, let's move on to the Q&A. I think we've got time for 1 or 2 questions. As we're taking those questions, again, some links to some resources here where you can download solution brief, 10-page white paper. There's a demo cast available as well. So, and if you can't find these, can't copy these links down quickly, just do a web search of Illumio and Appgate and it will direct you to these things. So let's take the first question we have here, which is, does the integration help with lateral movement from the context of a user connecting via SDP to the network resources? Meaning that user must not be able to do lateral movement between the network resources, especially if the user is not authorized to access certain resources. So I'll go ahead and answer that one. The answer is yes, that is precisely what Illumio and Appgate together integrated help ensure, is that only a specific user on a specific port or protocol can access specific resources. And once they're into the East-West network, they cannot move laterally into resources to which they don't have permission. So that's a level of granular control that Appgate and Illumio together provide. Let's see if we have time for maybe one more question here. And this one would be for Tony. What is the difference in Appgate SDP between the customer hosted and the isolated Appgate deployment model? Do both require on-prem SDP? So either Tony or Justin.
Sure. Well, I'll start, and Justin, you can correct me. What we're talking about is the control plane, right? So the ZTP is this security hub that makes these integrations more seamless, as I said, more of a no-code as we're expanding our partnership. And that is what we announced today. There's a press release on it, and it will dig into what ZTP is. It's really further the fact that it's not a single vendor, it's not a single product, and we believe that, and we're going to be able to expand this ecosystem we've done. We've announced that earlier. We integrate with Illumio, and as Illumio mentioned, we also have expanding integration. ZTP allows that to be more of a click to configure model. When you talk about SDP has 2 sides. There's a controller, which is a policy, and there's the enforcement point. The enforcement point will always be closer to those assets. So there will be on-prem, in the cloud, closer to that IoT. Now, the controller is what the difference was, right? The controller could be hosted and could be managed. We have an MSSP program, and we can offer managed services as well around that. Or you can actually choose to host that on-prem. So when you're talking about the SDP, is really the controller portion of the SDP that can be hosted or can be on-prem. But the gateways, the enforcement points always be closest to those assets, wherever they may be. Hopefully that answers that question.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Well, we have many more questions, but unfortunately, we're out of time. We will ensure that those questions that you all submitted are answered directly back to you via email. So we want to wrap things up, and I'd like to say, thank you, Tony and Justin, for joining me in this discussion. And thank you all in the audience for joining us today. Hopefully it was useful information, and have a great day, everybody.